Hello, and welcome to our Welcome Women webinar. That's kind of a mouthful, say that 3 times fast. I'm so glad for those of you that are able to join us live for this conversation about how do we talk to our kids about immigration. I personally am super excited that we're having this conversation. I have a 5-year-old son and an 8-year-old daughter. And in the years as I've been doing some immigration advocacy, people constantly ask me, how do you have these conversations with your kids? What do you tell them? What do you not tell them? How do you engage them in this topic and in this conversation and in advocacy work? So I'm super excited today to be joined by Alexandra Kuykendall and Amy Dolan, who both have experience working with moms and children in ministry. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But again, I want to just say welcome to those of you that are joining us live. Please, in the comments, share with us, say hi, and let us know how old your kids are. And if you have questions along the way, we would love to hear from you. So, Alex, I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself first.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me, Sarah. I'm super excited to talk about this topic because I think we have such an opportunity as parents to introduce the world to our kids. And that's what this is about, is introducing the world and even our neighbors who are from around the world to our kids. So I live in Denver. I'm right smack in the middle of the country. And we live right near downtown in the city. We have 4 children. They're all girls, ages 16, 13, 9, and 7. And our kids go to our neighborhood schools, which has been a big part of our family, the community that we live in. And my husband runs a ministry here in Denver that provides transitional housing to people coming out of homelessness. So we're also pretty involved in kind of the homeless services world here in the city. MOPS International is based here in Denver. So I was on staff there for almost a decade and have talked to thousands and thousands of moms about having hard conversations, but not just hard conversations, interesting conversations with our kids about topics that we want them to know about and about topics that impact our families. And I'm an author, and my latest book just came out last week. It's titled Loving My Actual Neighbor. And it is about having conversations with our neighbors that are different than us. And so all of this kind of ties into to this topic. So I also have a podcast with my friend Krista, the Open Door Sisterhood podcast, where we talk to different women about different topics. So that's who I am in a nutshell. Okay. Did we lose Sarah?
Hi, I'm back. Hopefully you can hear me. Let me see if I can get Alex back here. Can you hear me, Alex?
Yes, now I can see you and hear you.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened, but I reloaded and I could hear you the whole time. So I appreciate the introduction. And I see Amy here, so I'm going to add her back in as well. Whew, technical stuff. Am I right? I don't know. It might. I'm in Guatemala City, and my internet is not as fast as I have at home. So we'll see. If I bump out again, I'll reset it. So Amy, can you go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Yes, of course. Good to be back. I'm Amy Dolan. I am here in Chicago, downtown Chicago, on this lovely, I think it's 39-degree day today. So, you know, it's basically summer. I am a wife and a mom to a 3-year-old pit bull That is my baby, Maddox. And most of my career and ministry has been in children's ministry in various churches in the Chicago area as a family pastor and children's ministry director. And I have written curriculum and done church consulting with my company, Lemon Lime Kids, for, I think it's been almost 20 years now. It's crazy. And then just in the last 2 years, I started a dinner church here downtown Chicago. We're called Sunday Supper Church, and we gather on Sunday nights for church around the table. And so a lot of what we believe even in our church is that the best conversations with kids and students and adults happen around a table with food. So it's really fun to think about the topic of immigration and how to talk to kids and bring families together specifically around tables of food. And I love that. So yeah, so we have our church, and we have a podcast also called Feeding People, where we talk about the magic of the table. So a lot going on, and we're just hoping that it is like, there's no snow flurries this week in Chicago. That would be like, that would just kind of make our lives right now.
That's wonderful. Here in Guatemala, I guess next week is summer. So the kids have all their summer parties tomorrow, and it's like they're out of school for a week for summer. And so everyone's very excited. It's a different weather for sure. I want to welcome Mary Beth, who signed on. She says she has girls ages 8 and 11. And to anyone else who's joining us live, I invite you to say hello, let us know how old your kids are, and to ask any questions that you might have as we have this discussion. So my first question for both of you is, how do we walk that tightrope between shielding our kids from unnecessary pain while also opening their eyes to the reality of suffering in the world? Just that small little question.
Just that small.
So simple.
Well, I can go first. I think we're going to talk a little bit about age appropriateness specifically, but that's what we always have to keep in mind. And when I think about my children, I think about the adults I want them to be when they leave our home. And so having the end goal in mind of having empathetic, informed people that can go out in the world and do God's work on his behalf is my goal. I want them to love God and love others. So if I have that big picture in mind, then I'm always looking at, okay, what's the age appropriate element for this particular topic at hand? And really, when kids are little, we're trying to build a sense of empathy in them. Because if they're going to love God and love others, then they need to be able to empathize with others. So when it comes to immigration specifically, I always want to set kind of that baseline of creating empathy.
That's really great. I wrote it down. I'm like taking notes as you're talking. That's really, really great.
Yeah, so I would, of course, I agree with that. And I would add that I think it's important to watch what naturally emerges from your children. So, of course, in these days, the current culture that we're living in, our children at various ages are seeing what's happening in the news. They're hearing what's happening in their classrooms and from their teachers and their friends. And so sometimes it is impossible to shield them completely, right, from the suffering and the pain, even if it's too mature, too old for them. It's sometimes near impossible. But I think what's important is to watch what naturally emerges. So if your child comes home from school and asks a question about something he or she heard in the news, go with that. Right? Even if you weren't totally ready for it that day, or
I'm never ready.
Never ready, right? You're never ready. I think it's actually a beautiful thing when a child comes home and has noticed something gone on in the world and wants to discuss it with his or her parents. That's actually a really lovely thing, right? So go with that moment the best you can, sit down, talk it through, and just watch what naturally emerges. Of course, some kids are ready to have harder conversations earlier. Some kids are ready later. And I think it's just important as parents to notice your kids, observe your kids, and go with what's natural for them.
Oh, that's really, really helpful, really wise, really practical.
So, Sarah, as far as the shielding, I think, we, like Amy said, there are some things we can't control. So we have to look at What do we have control over and what do we not have control over as far as what they're being exposed to? And if we send them out into the world in any way, a lot of kids are home all the time. If they're homeschooled or if they're really little, they aren't exposed to much. But if we are sending them out into the world to any type of schooling or church experience outside of our control, then they are going to be exposed to things that we don't have necessarily control over. But we always have control over what happens in our home. So as far as the amount, the quantity of pain and images, especially, and sounds and news stories, we just really don't have cable news on our TV. Like, we don't have that constant news going. And some people, I go to other people's homes and it's kind of the background noise. I mean, even my own extended family, where I'm saying, could you just turn it off? Because it's this constant element of really trauma over and over. So we don't want to overexpose our kids. They may be exposed to things before we are ready, but we can always control the amount within our own homes and within our own cars. Like, I think of talk radio. I think of phone conversations that I have. Sometimes when I'm on the phone, I think, oh, this is a private conversation between me and the person on the other end. And to be aware of just constantly the intake, especially when our kids are little, that they're receiving.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I've had friends tell me that they've had to make decisions to switch off NPR in the car or other talk radio because just whatever is being talked about, it's not necessarily something they're ready to dive in with their kids. You've both alluded to it, and I think it's really important, this idea of age appropriateness. And so, I had a friend come to me recently whose daughter's preschool had taken, if you recall, at the border a few months ago when they had used tear gas, and there was that kind of iconic picture of that mother and child running away from the border at the tear gas, and the preschool had chosen to blow up that photo and hang it on the wall. Wow. And my friend was coming to me to get my opinion because she said, my daughter's having nightmares and I feel like it's not quite appropriate, but I also know this is a reality, and it's a reality for other kids her age. And so how do we make those judgment calls about what's age appropriate? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. That's the most difficult thing. And you can read, I always suggest becoming a child development generalist and expert, of course, read the books and watch the webinars and all of that, but also know that as the parent, you are the child development expert of your own children. Nobody knows your children like you do. And so if you read in a book or you see in the preschool that they're doing something that doesn't feel age appropriate to your child, have full confidence that you're the expert of that child, and you can go to the teacher, or you can, shut things down, or you can encourage conversations, or however it is. But I always say child development and age appropriateness is good and helpful, but so general. Right? We're all human living beings. And so be confident as a parent that you are the expert of your child. And even if your child is displaying, characteristics that seem young for his age or old for his age, it's okay. That's your child, and that's a living, breathing, beautiful soul that you can then advocate for and say what you need and what's best for that child.
Yeah. And Amy said earlier about, kind of grasping what your child shows interest in. And so that's also true if they're having a negative reaction. So a child that's having a nightmare, obviously that line has been crossed. It's gone too far. But asking questions is always great. And letting your kids ask questions. So, it's kind of, when we talk about talking to kids about sex, it's the same thing. You let your kids lead about how far they're comfortable with going, and you go up to that line with them. But instead of just bombarding them with information, which I have done, that is too much information, and then you can read their response. I think a better approach is to ask them open-ended questions about, well, how does that make you feel? And what do you think about that? And allowing them space to process in a way where they're still leading, but you are getting a little bit to the heart of where your child is. And then you can start talking to them about the larger values of your family and what you want them to know, specifically around immigration. And so we can talk a little bit about, I think, some specific things that we can do too with kids to introduce them in a positive way to our immigrant neighbors.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I read an article recently that was advocating something similar of when your child asks a really difficult question, like to respond with questions, because so often, because as parents, we have the bigger picture, we assume they're asking for all of the, you know, the whole kitchen sink. And that can be a way to be more intentional with what they actually want to know.
Right. And so like I take an example of if somebody has an accent. So my child may ask, why do they talk that way? If they're speaking English to us and they obviously have an accent. So instead of diving into the politics of immigration policy, you simply can say, my child, or to the child, you know, well, I think he's from Afghanistan or wherever you think that person's from. And then see, does that satisfy your child's interest? I just know, for me personally, I tend to go way deeper than I need to, especially when my kids are younger. Now, the benefit of having older kids is you can start to have some of those more complex conversations. But what I have also found from a parenting perspective is they just go better if you lead with questions and let your teenager lead with their opinions instead of starting to go into lecture mode, which I also have done, and it's just not that successful.
I love that. Before we kind of dive into some of the real practical ways that we can talk and engage our kids with immigration, I have one last kind of theoretical question or emotional question around, I think, you know, I was recently asked to do a talk about immigration to 7th graders. And it was right before actually Alex and I traveled together to the border at McAllen, Texas, and we went into the detention center and I saw 7th graders there. And I really wrestled with, how do we help kids process this vastly different story and this suffering that kids who look like them, who are their same age, who have, you know, some life similarities, but also big life differences. How do we help them kind of process through some of that dissonance? Have an answer for that?
What did you walk away? Yeah.
Well, you know, I think this is a big parenting question, especially as far as building empathy in our kids. And that's why, in order to have these conversations, really rich conversations when they're in 7th grade, it's helpful to be having conversations when they're in 1st grade about differences and different life experiences, and exposing our kids to people with different life experiences. And often, especially around immigration, I will hear people say, well, I live in a really rural, homogenous community or a suburban community. My kids' school isn't diverse. It's not like your children's experience, because our kids are exposed to people who are either 1st or 2nd generation immigrants in their schools. And I think kind of just having that building block of difference is okay, is the beginning of later having more complex conversations about suffering. And I think the same is true of exposing our kids to suffering. You know, my stepdad passed away 2.5 years ago, and my kids were part of that process. It's a different type of suffering, but to take what God has given you, the gold that he has given you in your life as a parent, to work with and say, okay, we may not have immigrant neighbors, although I think probably most Americans actually do, but we may not have immigrant neighbors that we have a relationship with, but we do have people in our community who are suffering. Mm-hmm. And that is the beginning of the building block for how we can then talk about this more complex topic.
I love that. And just to go along with what you said earlier about the open-ended questions, it's just great opportunity to build empathy when you ask your child, especially like a seventh grader, I wonder questions. I wonder what it must be like for that seventh grader. I wonder what it would be like to leave your home. I wonder what it would be like to be separated from your family. And again, in an age appropriate way, to not like pile on worry or guilt or shame or any of that, but to imagine what someone else's life might be like different than yours, I think does like open especially a seventh grader's heart to compassion and empathy and maybe new understanding.
Oh, I think that's really wonderful. We we live in Atlanta normally, and there was an interactive exhibit that came through by Doctors Without Borders called Forced from Home, and it was all about refugee resettlement and migration around the world. And I wasn't quite sure. My kids were underneath the recommended age, but we decided to try it out anyway and kind of mitigate along the way. And I remember having, my daughter, who's also a verbal processor, kind of looked at me at one point and she said, I don't know what I'm feeling, but my eyes are watering. Like I feel like I want to cry. And so being able to kind of talk about, yes, I feel the same way actually, and sort of talking about what is that emotion you're experiencing. And I love your language of building blocks of empathy. I do think that's, these kind of broader characteristics and ways that we want our children to engage in the world is really a helpful framework to think about rather than just specific topics. I'd love to talk a little bit, and we have kind of some resources we want to share, and but also talk about how we can use meal times to have meaningful conversations with our kids, how to create that space.
Great. Yes, let's talk about that. So I think, I just believe in the magic of the table, that something magical happens when you sit down at a table and you're eye to eye with someone else and you're able to eat the same food and have good conversation. It doesn't equalize all of us. Of course, we all come to the table still with all of the injustices and power dynamics in the world. But the table to me is the best shot we have at being able to have difficult conversations. And I often think when I pull my chair up to a table, I'm thinking about how can I really believe every person made in God's image, how can I expand my understanding of God by seeing the image of God in the person sitting across from me at the table? How can I learn something new about God by really seeking that image? And I think specifically around the topic of immigration and wanting to talk about it with our kids and build empathy, the table is just such a great place to do that. It doesn't have to be like a fancy dinner party, but like breakfast or lunch or dinner, whatever, a snack. You're sitting at the table together in a way that can connect your eyes to each other. And you can eat your food, you can have an activity, you can have conversation, and together, actually, you can learn about the image of God in others. And I think have opportunity as families to like be a team together at the table and say, how can we love immigrants? How can we love our neighbors better as a team, all sitting here together at this table? So I think the table is a really special place to be able to talk to our kids about the topic.
I love that idea of being all on the same team. That's, sort of a team meeting around the table.
Yeah, right, with snacks.
It was the best kind.
Yes.
Sarah, I grew up traveling internationally a lot, and my kids haven't had that same chance that I have. But I think food is a great way to introduce different cultures to our children. It's a very non-threatening kind of thing. So even the food that we serve or the restaurants that we go to can be a starting place as far as introducing them to the idea of people coming from all over the world. And then, of course, if you live in a community where you have immigrants, you can go to their restaurants, you can invite them over, that you can learn culturally, I think, around the table from our neighbors, simply just through the food and kids are responsive to that, no matter the age. It's an exciting adventure.
Yes, very, very true. That sounds great. And we have actually, I'll share a little bit about something we've put together at Welcome. And Amy can help me with this as well, because she helped put it together. And then I'd love to talk a little bit about advocacy. But when we think about the opportunity to have mealtime conversations, Welcome is actually releasing this week what we're calling our Welcome Family Toolkit, which includes dinner time conversations. And it helps you as a family have a template to kind of walk through scripture, to have Bible-based lessons around hospitality and welcome, and to begin to have those conversations with your kids around immigration. And so, Amy, if you would just share a little bit more about what that's the heart behind that and what's included, so that, and folks can download it for free. I'll include that link in the comments.
Yeah, I'm so proud of this resource. I think it's just a really, really great opportunity for families to engage in these conversations together. So like you mentioned, Sarah, we included 3 nights of dinner conversations. So you can sit at the table. And again, it's really simple. Like, anything that's too hard, we're just not, any of us are going to do, right? So
Sure.
We tried to make it as simple as possible. You sit down, you ask a few questions. We actually included a little, there's a paper house at the end of the dinner conversations that you can actually each night during your conversation, if you have more tactile kids who maybe just don't want to sit and talk, they can be folding and building and coloring this house as they think of home, people who've had to leave their home, what home means, all of that. They can be doing that at the same time. So we've got the dinner conversations in the toolkit. We've also got coloring sheets. There's scripture coloring sheets we created. So, I mean, you can like mix and match all of the resources together. If a kid wants to be coloring their scripture sheet while you're discussing the topic at dinner, great. We've got a family journal. So there's a few days where members of your family can kind of have quiet time alone, and they can be journaling about the things God is leading them in. That's what I really hoped for this time, was intentional conversations for families, but then also that God would really lead each person in the family, and then the family as a unit, to consider what it is for them specifically to do in order to be more welcoming towards immigrants in their neighborhood. And we finish with a neighbor dinner. We actually included a really simple way, like you had mentioned, Alex, which is really great, like a way to invite your neighbor over for dinner, or an immigrant family that you know. And a chef friend of mine wrote a recipe for a soup where you actually you bring ingredients all together and then you make it together. So it's a really lovely thing to do. And then you eat and you talk about and you learn about each other's experience. And yeah, our hope is that families would engage together in really simple and meaningful ways, and that because of that, God would lead and stir and move and unite families, and home by home, table by table, we just all become a little bit more welcoming and be able to see the image of God in all of our neighbors.
Oh, I love that. And yes, it is a really terrific resource. Oh, Mary Beth said her kids have loved the coloring sheets. They already downloaded it and have started using it. So that's great to hear.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so it's a wonderful free resource from Welcome. I'll include the download link, but we would love for you to take a look at that. Again, just like Amy said, we want to make it as simple and easy for you as a parent to be able to talk about these topics with your kids, starting with home. What is it like? You know, why does God provide us homes, and what does that look like? And so as I think too about going beyond our own home and what it means to welcome, I want to talk just a little bit before we go about kind of advocacy and thinking about how you've maybe engaged your kids in educational or advocacy opportunities. I know in our family, we have involved our kids a little bit in some demonstrations and different things, and that has always opened rich conversations. We've talked about Esther and what it means to sometimes speak up for the vulnerable, and we've talked about ways that people do things that we don't agree with, all these kinds of things. And so I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on engaging kids kind of in educational or advocacy activities outside of the home.
Well, again, when you think about the long-term goal for our children, I think that's what we're always asking ourselves, my husband and I, as parents. What's our long-term goal for our kids? And it is for them to form their own opinions about things too, which can be frustrating as a parent because we we want to control what our kids think. I mean, we have our values and our beliefs for a reason, and we believe in them. And so I think the best thing to do is to live life as an advocate in front of our children, and to not be so worried about, am I checking this off of my to-do list? That these are the 10 things I need to do, but how am I demonstrating to my children what it means to be a person following God as an adult in front of them, and then take them along when possible. And so, for example, that trip that you and I went on, Sarah, I wanted to bring my 16-year-old daughter, but she wouldn't have been allowed to go into the facilities that we went into. It wouldn't have been appropriate. But I can take her into places and communities here in our neighborhood. And one of my daughters loves baking. She's the 9-year-old. And so there is a Mexican bakery that we go to often in our neighborhood, because it combines her personal passion with our ability to support a small immigrant-owned business in the community. And so it's not this big political thing. It's simply living life together and saying, what is our goal? Where do your passions meet my passions as your parent, and me wanting to expose you to things in a way that doesn't feel forced? And I will say that as my girls have gotten older, the older girls are starting to engage in conversations at school in their classrooms that are being led by adults that often have different opinions than we do as parents, and their peers are articulate and have informed opinions, sometimes uninformed opinions. They're teenagers, but they have opinions. And for us to be able to process with our kids, knowing that they, especially our oldest, very soon is going to be leaving home. And so we want to have open discussions, knowing that we are now, with an age-appropriate way, we are now coaching our kids, but we are more saying, this is what we believe and why. And the litmus test for a teenager is, does your life demonstrate that? And so, again, it gets back to, am I being an advocate in my role as an adult, as a citizen of, I happen to be a citizen of the United States, but also I'm a citizen of God's kingdom. And so how am I working out my citizenship in front of my kids?
Oh, I love that. Great.
Sometimes the hardest forms of advocacy, well, I think always the hardest forms of advocacy are the one-on-one conversations, right? With a family member or a friend who maybe disagrees or isn't as open to hearing. And I think, like you said, to take opportunities as an adult and a parent to be able to advocate for yourself and for your neighbor in a one-on-one conversation is some of the bravest things we can do. And to do that and show your child, like, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to have a meal. We're going to advocate for our neighbor in this way. This is what we do. And to be honest with your kid and say, this is really hard for me. Like, this feels like a really brave thing I'm doing, but that's what we do in this family. We do really brave and courageous things. And if I can do it, you can do it. And then celebrate that bravery together. Every time you do something that's an advocate type conversation or an act or a march or all that, celebrate how difficult or hard it was and the bravery that your family just demonstrated together.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's beautiful.
I think we talk about these big macro issues, but most of our opportunities are on the micro level, the one-on-one. So how are you, if you have, for example, immigrant parents at your school, how are you interacting with those parents? How are you advocating for those kids in your child's classroom that whose parents may not be familiar with any education system, much less the one in the United States, whose language may be a barrier, but just the authority of a teacher may feel intimidating. For many of us, a teacher does not intimidate me, but for another parent, it may. So how am I advocating on the micro level where I probably have the most influence? That doesn't mean that I need to ignore the big issues that are happening on the national level, but I do need to be aware that I can talk about those big issues all day long, but if I'm not doing anything for my actual neighbor, then it doesn't mean much.
Yes.
Oh, that's a really great reminder. And I think the perfect way to kind of wrap up this webinar. as we look at how do we love our neighbors, how do we demonstrate welcome and hospitality in front of our kids and invite them into that through both just that sort of osmosis parenting of lived experience, but also with these intentional conversations and helping cultivate in them a heart that's empathetic and informed and who loves God and loves others. So thank you so much, Alex and Amy, for joining us. I have half a page of notes that I will be going back to look at in my own parenting, and I'm sure that those who have joined us also took away some great nuggets of wisdom for their parenting and life as well. So thank you both so much. Thank you to those who joined us, and this will be available for replay, and I will include the link to download our Welcome Family Toolkit. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.